Welcome to our webinar on sports funding today. Whether you're looking at ways for paying for ongoing sports activities or looking at financing new sports facilities, today's webinar will have some ideas for you on how to get the job done. First, let me say thank you and welcome Jeff Gaduck, President of Premier Travel Media. Jeff was the catalyst for this webinar and is one of our co-hosts today. Please look at Jeff's Sports Planning Guide. It's the leading premier guide for sports tournament planners. Also, Jeff partners with dozens of DMOs and sports commissions on custom publishing initiatives. Jeff, good morning.
Good morning, John, and hello, everyone. So for the last 2 decades, Premier Travel Media has been a leader in showcasing tourism destinations to niche travel audiences. We've worked with literally hundreds of DMOs across the country and helping them attract sports tourism, family travelers, and different types of leisure group travelers. This webinar idea hatched out of my curiosity to find better ways to fund tourism development and infrastructure. It led me to John, which sparked a conversation. And at the conclusion of our call, we both asked, what's next? So here we are. I appreciate your curiosity, your time, and your attendance today. We're all here to learn from the experts. If you would like to know more about how we're helping DMOs through the recovery process, please visit our brand new website, literally as of 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, ptmgroups.com. And John, I'll turn it back over to you to kick off the formal program.
Great. Thanks, Jeff, and congratulations on your new website. Our agenda today is packed full of information. First, we're going to have a welcome from Al Kidd at Sports ETA. I think it's really important when we talk about sports tourism that we first talk about the importance of our industry, both from a financial standpoint and a community standpoint. We're going to be sharing ideas with you from our recently released Funding Future study. This was a study that took quite a few months, was a partnership of several firms, and really has I don't use this word very often, but a plethora of ideas as it relates to funding. You should check it out. We're going to do a deeper dive into 2 of the concepts that have been used for sports funding. That is tax increment financing, both property tax and sales tax increment financing, as well as tourism improvement districts. But really today, I'm most excited about our panel. And on our panel, I'm going to introduce these folks in greater detail a little later, but we're really lucky to have Susie Santo, the president and CEO of Visit Wichita, and David Attaway, the CEO of Placer Valley Tourism. Both have really been trailblazers in their own right as it relates to funding for sports activities. But first up today is Al Kidd. Al Kidd is president and CEO of the Sports Events and Tourism Association. He joined Sports ETA back in April of 2017. Since joining Sports ETA, Kidd has repositioned and rebranded the association, establishing a more inclusive brand to lead the sports events and tourism industry and its membership. He also implemented a new strategic plan, Vision 2020, to advance the future of sports tourism. Kidd serves on the board of directors for USA Fencing and the International Association of Event Hosts. Welcome, Al Kidd.
Thank you, John, and I'm very proud to be a part of this esteemed panel today and beyond with David and Susie. You couldn't pick 2 better people who are on the leading edge of what's going on in sport tourism as we know across the country. And John and I's background go back a long time. We worked together for a number of years in the early days of San Diego, and which was one of the early TIDs, and we spent quite a bit of time perfecting metrics to be able to justify and prove to our funding partners the great work that sports was able to contribute. And I appreciate that, John, over all these years. Sports is really here is one of the major components of sports tourism, of tourism in general, I'm sorry. And, there's 2 forms of the tourism most people know, the leisure and the group. And our group is really tournament travel and tournament play. And that's been the part that's been most affected, as we all know, through this COVID. We're looking at the signs of recovery, and everybody asks me on a daily basis, how can Susie and David, get engaged again and get their communities bringing in money and bringing activities and making a difference. And really, there's a couple things that have to happen, despite all that you read or listen to. If you really look at 3 indicators, look at when states begin to align their opening dates. That makes a difference because now you can cross over state lines without any problems. Look when they start to and begin to expand the group groupings of tournament play and how many people can get together in a group, and when the normalization of high school sports comes back together. Once those three happen, we're going to be on our pathway back, and sports tourism will again take its place as one of the lead indicators, one of the lead contributors to communities. But as we reset, this whole world of sports right now, you're reading all the time about the NCAA and the USOPC, and there appears to be some changes coming in amateur sports. The one thing I can tell you is that our panelists today are going to talk about a couple really significant changes coming in how we measure the success of our work collectively. One of which is widening success and coming up with a new scorecard. Its economic impact is important, but community sentiment and what it does for the community for employment and goodwill and feelings and the earned media, very, very important. You're going to hear a little bit of that today. And the importance of facilities and the role they play in community growth and tourism expansion. And despite what you may be hearing, there's no oversaturation of sports facilities. And David will talk about that a little bit today. So with that, I will turn myself back to John. And again, thank you very, very much. Those that speak today will talk about the acceleration of these changes. And they are at the tip of the spear of where the changes are coming. So John, thank you for inviting Sports ETA to play a role at this. And back to you, my friend.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your great leadership and all you're doing for this industry. Sports ETA has really changed significantly since you took over. And we appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you for joining us. As I mentioned at the outset, it's important that we talk not only amongst ourselves, but to all of our community stakeholders and leaders about the importance of our industry. And I really want to talk about the importance in two different subsets. One is the data. What data can we share about what our industry does as an economic driver? And second is community. How can we talk about where our industry is with respect to the community? So first, on the data side, I think all of you know that are listening to this, that sports, travel, and tourism drives overnight room stays. And you can see in 2019, that reached a high of 26.4 million travelers that stayed overnight. And in fact, it's an estimated over 54% of all sports travelers spent the night in the event's destination. And that's really what led to that investment, that spend of approximately $45 billion by sports tourism participants. And beyond that, in terms of the economic data, and this is thanks to the report done by Al Kidd and his organization at Sports ETA, as well as Adam Sachs at Tourism Economics, that $32.2 billion in personal income associated with our industry, almost 740,000 jobs, and an important $14.6 billion in taxes. It is an incredible driver. But let's talk about the other side of what sports does for our communities. And if you've watched what Destinations International and Jack Johnson has been doing over the last couple of years, is really focusing our industry on providing benefits and talking about those benefits to our residents. They call it community shared values. Well, nowhere is there a greater example of an industry that promotes community shared values than sports tourism. And think about all the work that all of you do to bring sports into your communities. It is raising the quality of life for your residents. It's improving the mental and physical well-being of children in our communities. It's also raising the profile of your destination. We're going to hear about that a little later from the panel. Some of the sporting events they're able to bring in and what it does for their destination. It's building facilities that not only benefit those traveling athletes, but also benefit our residents. And finally, if you think about the sporting events that many of us hold in our communities, we really are creating community centers for families. That is a center for communities to come together where they can build relationships and build bonds. There isn't a better example, I don't think, of an industry that emphasizes importance for our community than the sports field. And please use these ideas, use these concepts as you communicate to your leaders and your stakeholders about the importance of what you do each and every day. All right, let's talk about the palette of funding. And we at Civitas spend a great deal of time researching and thinking about funding for folks within our industry. We think about both the private side of funding and the public side of funding. And these private funding initiatives that are here on the screen are going to look familiar to you. Memberships and sponsorships, of course, and event revenue goes without saying. Folks every day are looking at ways to maximize that, and certainly in the COVID era, looking at ways to bring that back post-COVID. We also see organizations doing contract services, and that is oftentimes with a city, local government, a park district, providing services on their behalf, entering into contracts that produce revenue for those organizations. And finally, I wanted to mention both licensing and naming rights. We're seeing more and more of this. We're seeing communities actually take stock of the assets they have and figure out ways to license their assets, as well as secure funding from naming rights for their facilities. On the public side, we talk about untethered tax allocations and tethered tax allocations. What are these? Essentially tax allocations, meaning a government just grants you money. They say, here's for a sporting event, here's some funding that we'll give you for this sporting event. Tethered tax allocations are linked to some tax revenue generating source. Most often is bed tax, but we've seen this also linked to sales tax. We've seen tethered tax allocations linked to gaming revenues. There are a number of tethered tax allocations as well. Two items that we are going to be doing a deeper dive into are property tax increment financing and sales tax increment financing. Most of you are familiar with the first. We see this in downtowns and commercial areas across the country. Sales tax increment financing is not nearly as widespread, but we are seeing this used, and we do have an example today of sports activities that are receiving money through a sales tax increment financing model. And finally, special benefit assessments. These are like taxes, but they're required to show a benefit back to the payers. And this is important because these monies can't be diverted. And so we've seen DMOs, many people on the line today have tourism improvement districts currently. Some are looking at expanding their tourism improvement districts, either from a geography standpoint or to include other stakeholders. It's very common for folks to be looking to include, for example, vacation rentals. Some are including restaurants and retail. These are all assessment districts. And we're going to be hearing more about assessment districts for capital improvements. Can you use this to build the sports facility that you're looking to establish? Our study released just a couple of months ago, the Funding Future Study. Good news is this study is free. If you go to our website at civitasadvisors.com, you can pick up a free copy of this study. We originally started this after COVID to give people ideas about funding. It started as a small study and grew and grew and grew. It now is 125 pages. It was an amazing collaboration led by Miles Partnership and Tourism Economics and Civitas. Boy, thank you to our partners. They put a lot of work into this to really give folks great ideas and really drill down on some of those topics. So please pick up a copy, read those sections that are important to you, and hopefully it will give you some ideas on funding. I also wanted to say thank you to U.S. Travel Destinations Council and Destination Marketing Association of Canada. Both helped sponsor work on this study. And our friends at Destination Analysts and Destinations International also added to this study to make it a robust, great source of information for you. In fact, just a few days ago on December 1st, Skift wrote an article about some of the funding ideas that are included in the study. Check out that Skift article if you haven't already, but we appreciate Skift covering these ideas that we're bringing to folks. Well, one of the things we did on the study was we did a lot of survey work. We did some focus group work. We did some one-on-one meetings with DMO leaders and folks in the sports industry as well. And we looked at their funding objectives, their funding opportunities, their funding constraints. Certainly in COVID, funding has been a tremendous challenge. Well, over 70% of the US DMOs said within the next year, they're going to be looking at changing up their funding, and they're looking for more sustainable sources to do that. And almost 40% of the state travel offices said the same. The report itself is broken into three categories. First, response. Second, resilience. And third, regeneration. Response, of course, this involves all the emergency funding opportunities that are out there, whether it was PPP for C3s or C6s getting ready for PPP. Really important now that Congress is talking about moving on a bill. Really important that you get ready for that program and you be prepared. We can help you with that more offline, but this is something that every DMO and Sports Commission Corporation should be doing. We looked at various stimulus funding. We've helped bureaus and DMOs with their EDA grants. We've helped them with the coronavirus relief funding that they've gotten, all kinds of emergency funding. These are covered in the report. As it relates to resilience, what could be more important these days for a future than building reserves? We look at shared risk models, including insurance, and there are some unique opportunities that DMOs have taken advantage of in terms of sharing some of their risk. We looked at roles and responsibilities and structures of DMOs. It's so important when we're talking about funding to say, what are the activities that we're funding and what are our emphasis within our space? We looked at the evolution of dedicated funding, and this included tourism improvement districts. We looked at sales tax increment funding, co-op funding, and short-term rental, because so many folks now are looking at opportunities to bring short-term rental revenue into their funding picture. And finally, we looked at regeneration. That is outcome-based funding models. Many of the European destinations have been a leader here, actually setting up their funding to get certain outcomes. And finally, regenerative funding. How can we raise money to not only make our destinations sustainable, but make them even better? And that's all covered in the study. What we've seen on the sports and activities facilities side is the use of bed tax, as many of you know and have used. We're seeing that more and more. We are looking very hard at and have begun using tax increment financing for some of these projects, both property tax and sales tax, and tourism infrastructure districts as well on the capital side. And anytime you look at these kinds of funding mechanisms, whether it's bed tax, whether it's tourism improvement districts, of course, in COVID, I get asked the question a lot, hey, John, how are our hotels possibly going to be looking at something like this? And what we found is the majority of our hotels are looking into the future. They are looking at recovery, and they're saying, what do we have to do to be successful in recovery? Can we implement something that will help us 6 months or a year from now to be as successful as possible as we come out of a recovery? And of course, one of the things we want to look at is what are the underlying rates? And so we've studied tax rates on hotels extensively. We did a study 2 years ago with US Travel, first looking at 100 destinations. As part of this study, we updated those results. And we found in 2 years, 25 of the 100 destinations had increased their hotel room taxes. In fact, in bigger cities, that number went up from 15.4 to 15.9%. What does that mean? That means for larger cities, we're just about 16% on average, all in at checkout. So we deal with destinations that are 17, 18% and higher, and still looking at very small, modest increases to be able to fund their particular programs. In the average overall in the study, the average went up from 14.6 to 14.9%. Many of you know about property tax increment financing. This has been around for 50 years. It exists in 49 of the 50 states. It essentially is the concept of drawing a circle around properties, generally in a commercial area, and saying, how much did we raise in property tax? Let's say we raise $100 million this year. Next year, we raise $110 million. That $10 million is the tax increment, and taking that tax increment and reinvesting it back into the area. Typically, these monies have been used for bricks and mortar sorts of improvements. We've seen them for arenas and stadiums and other sporting facilities, and certainly we'll see more of that into the future. Typically, you're taking that increment revenue and bonding against it to get those monies up front to pay for the facility that you need. Much less widely covered is the concept of sales tax increment financing. And many of you probably may have heard about this or may not know about it, but this is a real possible future funding mechanism for a lot of folks out there. It too is based on the incremental increase, but instead of property taxes, this increment is sales tax increment. So we take those businesses that are tourism related, We look at them either by NAICS codes or SIC codes, and we say for these businesses, their increase in sales tax, we will take some portion of that increase, that increment, and invest it back into sports, back into tourism. And so it is a performance alternative. It is a way to say, if we do well, if we're able to generate more sales tax, then we get a portion of that upside for our funding. Now, Utah is by far the most example of this. Their state travel office put together, boy, I just love this name, the Marketing Performance Fund, the Tourism Marketing Performance Fund, because it's all about performance. And they basically said to their state, look, if we perform well, we deserve an investment of some portion of that revenue that we raise of sales tax. And the legislature and the governor said yes. And so they've seen this fund go from anywhere from $7 million, most recently up to $25 million. And importantly for today's conversation, if you look at the funding allocation of these sales tax dollars in Utah, you see at the bottom there, 10% of that money is dedicated specifically back to the Sports Commission. Well, tourism improvement districts, I hope all of you have heard about these and know about these. I know many of you have them. We're seeing more and more of them. In the last 10 years, the number of states that have these districts has tripled, right? So we're going to see even more growth in this. This is an assessment on hotels, sometimes on short-term rentals, sometimes on other tourism or sports related kinds of businesses, could be activity businesses, could be attractions. We've seen even restaurants and retail included, but essentially assessments are raised, they're collected by the local government, and they're managed by the DMO or Sports Commission. Some of the aspects to these districts is they do create a level playing field, no free riders, they're reliable, and they have pass-through to the guests so that the business itself is not seeing an underlying increase in charge to their bottom line. One of the important considerations in the sports context of TID versus tax is, first of all, who has to approve these? So if you're looking at potentially a bed tax increase or a bed tax diversion of some money into a sports facility, who has to approve that? And that varies widely from state to state and locality to locality. But what we find again and again is the TIDs oftentimes are easier to put in place than the tax considerations. Oftentimes you don't have to go to the state legislature. In those states that require a vote of the populace for tax increases, they typically don't require a vote for TIDs. And so typically we're finding that the industry, if it's supportive, has an easier time putting together a TID than a tax increase. And second, and this is really important, where we've seen these used for capital improvements, typically when you're funding capital improvements, you've got to raise a lot more money than you expect to need just for the debt payments, right? The bondholders, they want to see coverage. They want to see that you've got plenty of resources ready to go. In most issuances, if you raise that money through a tax mechanism, any leftover money at the end of the day typically goes back to the local government. That is not true for most TID funded capital improvements. That money can go to use for marketing. So when there's money left over from a capital improvement investment in a TID context, that goes back to your pockets to be able to market those activities, which is another reason that we've started to see TIDs really used for that purpose. Well, I hope many of you have seen this slide before. We have 183 TIDs. The smallest one raises $10,000 a year. The largest that Al mentioned earlier, San Diego, pre-COVID numbers was set to raise $41 million this year. Those are levied in one of two ways, either based on a percentage of room night revenue or a fixed dollar per occupied room per night. You can see 56% are based on gross revenue, 44% on fixed dollar, and now those are in 17 states around the country from east to west. We have 10 states that are currently working on legislation right now for 2021. We expect to see several more states come online in the coming year. Okay, now to the best part of our presentation today, our panel. And let me start by introducing our panelists, and I'm going to ask them to go ahead and turn on their videos and join our conversation. First up, I'm really pleased to introduce my friend, Susie Santo, President and CEO of Visit Wichita. In 2014, she led the initiative to create the state's first tourism business improvement district. This was only 2 years after she took over as CEO. And this new funding source is used to market Wichita to unprecedented levels and is used for their sports activities programs. Prior to joining Visit Wichita, Susie had a successful career as a senior executive for 19 years with Universal Studios Hollywood, where she held numerous positions in operations, brand marketing, product development, and sales. She currently serves on local, state, and national boards. I'll just mention a few: Wichita Chamber of Commerce, the Downtown Development Corporation, the Sports Commission, the Independent School Board, the Travel Industry Association of Kansas, and notably the U.S. Travel Board. Where I first met Susie was when she was in California, and she previously served as the board chair of the California Travel Association. Welcome, Susie. Thank you for joining our panel today.
John, it's great to be here, my friend.
Excellent. And also with us today is David Attaway, the current CEO of Placer Valley Tourism and At the Grounds. During his tenure, he strengthened and expanded Placer Valley Tourism sports tourism program through creation of an extensive major project capital fund. And he was one of the first to do this. So David's got a lot of really interesting experiences to share. To solve the obstacle of getting this facility built, they embarked on renovating an 80-year-old fairgrounds, adding a state-of-the-art 160,000 square foot facility that holds either 12 basketball courts or 24 volleyball courts, which opened in 2020. 85% of the $47 million cost was paid for by Placer Valley Tourism, utilizing its TID assessment stream as the sole collateral for the bonds. Aside from working for nonprofit tourism organizations, Mr. Attaway spent 15 years in the casino industry. While working for Caesars and Aladdin Gaming, he held numerous positions ranging from entertainment, marketing, and casino operations to president. Welcome, David.
Thank you, John.
Boy, it's great to see you both today. And Susie, I just love your sports background there. That is phenomenal.
Thank you.
Let's start with you if we could. You started as CEO with Visit Wichita 8 years ago. Can you talk about the importance of sports tourism to Wichita?
Absolutely. John, I think your beginning slide, when you talked about the value for the community, that hit it right on the head. When you think about sports, I think you're going to be hard pressed to find a community anywhere that doesn't benefit from sports. And when we look at sports and tourism, we kind of look at three components. Of course, the economic activity that it brings to a community. So we look at, does it motivate economic activity? Does it attract national attention? And that's been so much of it, when you can bring in a sporting event that does that. But I think really that third component we look at as, does it strike a chord with the locals? Because that's really important. And when you're able to do all three of those, then you've got, great opportunity to bring huge value to the community. And really this comes back to, when you look at it, and Al talked about it at the beginning, the quality of life. And sports are uniquely positioned to play a huge impact on the quality of life. And as we talk about it, and I'm sure most of you are involved in conversations like this around the country, when you're thinking about how do you attract talent to your community and how do you retain talent, you're looking at those quality of life amenities. And sports really are huge. So when you look at it, from whether it's dollars, attention to your community, or quality of life for your residents and visitors, sports are really important.
And so, Susie, when you communicate that to your stakeholders, is that how you're communicating? You're talking about quality of life in addition to sort of all the stats and the economic value that the sports bring?
That's a great question, John. It really depends on who I'm speaking to. So economic impact still continues to be really, that's the first question that we're asked by the media. Whenever we announce a new event coming to town, they always want to go to the economic impact. So we still talk about that. And on a side note, like many of you, I go up to City Council every year for our approval of our budget. And we have two funding streams, and one of it is through that transient guest tax. So when I go there and we look at our deliverables, we completely I'd say, came up with a whole new way of looking at about 2 years ago. We used to have the traditional, and coming from the Bureau, we have the group side of meetings and convention and sports. And we used to look at it, specifically on those marketing activities, advertising impressions and room nights. And now really I have two goals, and it's about being good stewards with our dollars, and two, that economic impact. So we do talk about that. But when you hit on an event that touches on quality of life, you almost don't need to talk about the economic impact because the community has experienced it. And that's really when it's a home run, because they see firsthand the value. So really, kind of the long and the short of it, depending who I'm speaking to, you kind of alter that message.
And David, let's get you in here. I know many of our listeners today are from medium and small size communities, and they're fascinated by what you've done and interested to learn basically how you do it. Even though your destination does include smaller cities, you were able to pull off a pretty big project. Can you tell us about how you made that happen?
Well, our board, which has a very courageous idea that we needed something to fill our shoulder season for the hotels. Again, we're solely a tourism improvement district funded. And so we were looking at how do we make sure that we're able to deliver product during the winter months. We really didn't have anything. We had a strong sports tourism program that went from May to October, but didn't have a whole lot indoors. So our goal was to put together a structure that would allow us to build a new indoor facility to compete. And so we started looking around. Our cities were not going to really give us any of the transient occupancy tax to do it. So we went out to look at the tourism improvement district and worked with some banks to figure out how to leverage all three cities into it. Some of the challenges are each one of the city has a different TOT tax rate. So we were 6, 8, and 10. So blending that all together and trying to figure out, we needed to make sure that we were in a structure where we were a per room revenue stream as opposed to a percentage, because it gave us much more credibility and stability, especially as everyone knows now, the rate is much more fluctuates than do our total sales, perhaps with the exception of this year. And so we were able to define it and to secure funding that didn't require us to have any asset put up, with the exception of the assessment stream. So none of the cities or counties, that nobody had to give up land or about capital property.
So you had 3 cities, all with different rates of bed tax, and you had to sort of bridge the gaps across that, and you levied an assessment that was the same across all 3 cities?
Yes, we did. And that was a challenge because obviously we needed a significant increase in our tourism improvement district. We were at $1 and $1.50, and we needed to go to $6.50. And so one of our challenges were some of our smaller hotels that had a lower ADR. To absorb $6.50 on $100 is very different than absorbing $6.50 on a $200 room. So in our agreement to make sure all the hotels could support the project, we put in a step so that it went from the $1.50 or $1 to $4.25, and then 2 years later went up to $6.50. And that gave us 2 things: gave us some early capital for design work, as well as, again, one of our key issues is to invest capital into the cities and counties and universities' existing facilities so we can upgrade them and make them tournament ready and attractive to organizers.
Fantastic. And I know anytime anyone tries to do a project like that, there are always naysayers. There are always folks out there ready to say, won't happen, right? David, did you run into that?
Sure, and we're small cities because we're in California, and other states would be larger cities. But the challenge was nobody had ever done it. And so I actually had a city CFO who sat on my board and good friends with another one. Neither of them believed it was doable to achieve the financing. And really up until we got it, they weren't sure that it could happen. But we worked very closely with some banks and walked them through, got to the coverage, which you talked about, that was significant. And even though we did almost 2-time coverage, which I thought was astronomically high, well, COVID proved that it wasn't astronomically high. So it did allow us that leverage. What the CFOs found was private placement of the bond structure was a much easier, less costly, which is what we did with the assessment bonding.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I know when we're communicating about what we're doing, there's always challenges about the way we communicate. And Susie, I know you mentioned when you took over as CEO that you were talking originally about sort of not only on the sports front, but just in general, talking about tourism to Wichita. And you found you needed to shift course on that. What
Yeah.
tell us that?
Yeah, coming from Universal, tourism, travel and tourism was just, that's how we talked about it. But coming here to Wichita, and I found early on as I was talking about that, it didn't really resonate. And then finally, in a conversation with one of our county commissioners, was talking about, and he said, "You mean visitors?" And we started talking about visitors, and everyone could relate to visitors. And so just kind of, I talk about visitors into our community because we all have visitors that come, and whether it's for a meeting or, an aunt coming to visit you. So it's really kind of shifting it for the audience.
Breaking it down into something that is meaningful to them. And
You
to
got
really
it.
say, look, when we're doing this new sports event, we're talking about bringing visitors into our community
Absolutely.
and all the investments that come along with it, right? And Susie, I know that you have several funding streams into the Bureau. One is the Tourism Improvement District that you created. And in fact, you were the first in Kansas to do that. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your experience in going through that? If they're thinking about doing that, perhaps for sports funding or for other kinds of funding, what kinds of things would you share with them about your experience?
I would say run, don't walk. Absolutely do it. And, it's interesting. I think coming from California and had seen firsthand the benefit of the business improvement districts when I wasn't even in this field, working for an attraction. I didn't work for a destination. And so it was interesting, John, and the first time I was introduced to it, I sat into a session that you gave at one of the conferences. And I thought, if I ever have an opportunity that I'm in this role, it seemed like a no-brainer. And so what it's allowed us to do, I came here in 12, we started conversations in 13, and then we started it in 14. And we've raised, I think I was looking at, I don't know, $20 million or some amount in that time. And it has allowed us to completely reposition Wichita through our branding efforts, through our leisure efforts. But a piece of that obviously is sports. And coming into the market, looking at sports, there was nobody 24/7 thinking about bringing sports to Wichita. And so we had a sports commission, and they were doing a great job with their homegrown events that they were producing. But with a different funding model, they were looking at how do you make money versus how do you bring that economic impact to the community and the quality of life and all of that we've talked about. So sports was really important in those early days of allowing us to have the dollars now to set it up, to go after it, to bring, and now 7 years later to see the benefits of it. And it's even become, I think sports have become even more, a bigger part of this than I thought it would have been 7 years ago.
Is that right? They grew
Yeah.
to a bigger component. Why was that? You were mostly thinking about group business originally, or?
I think realizing and taking stock of what we had as our facilities. We had facilities here that I don't think we tapped into our own strengths. And so when I came into the market, I kind of looked at what had been done. And, I didn't realize at the time that no one would think of Wichita for ice hockey or ice events, right? Because we're in the middle of the Kansas, you think of the East Coast. We had 3 sheets of ice within a mile. And that's huge when you think about ice centers. And so that really played nicely to go after, with U.S. figure skating and bring U.S. figure skating into Wichita, which wouldn't think of the middle of the country. So it's like tapping into the streaks of your community. And from we're a basketball community. And so as we've tapped into the strengths that we have, and then realizing that if we can align with the strategic interest, not only of our business, but our elected officials, it allows it to grow. And I'll use one example of how important that is. We have a company here called Envision, and they're a company that advocates for a higher quality of life for visually impaired, and it's a very large company. And so we were able to partner with them, bring them involved when we went after BEEP World Series baseball, which is baseball for the visually impaired. And so we'll be bringing the BEEP Baseball World Series to Wichita. But if we didn't have that local component that was interest to the community, we wouldn't have been able to be as successful in attracting them. So when you can tap into those interests. So long story short, there's so many interests in sports and different aspects of the community that as we've tapped into that, it's taken probably a bigger portion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, terrific, terrific. And David, your funding stream now, you did this very novel idea, really the first in the state and really to our knowledge, the first in the country that used the TID money in the way you did to build this sports facility. But your funding model covers both the facility itself and marketing for those sporting events. Is that right?
That's correct, which allows us to have the facility, but also to market it well and supply the programs that we need to entice folks to come and use the facilities.
Now, I can't imagine how, when you were working on this, how you sold this to your community leaders and your stakeholders, right? I think some people have an appreciation for what sports can bring and others really don't. How were you able to communicate that importance of the facility to the community?
Well, the community is very sports oriented anyway. That's always been, and I think to what Susie's saying, it's very important. Do an assessment of what your community has and do that evaluation, which is exactly what we did, So we had all the outdoor stuff taken care of. We're not a meeting destination as of yet. So selling sports as a concept was easy. The other challenge is to make sure the three cities feel they're getting an equal part of it, as well as the hoteliers. But our hoteliers were great. Our board was courageous. Our staff was tenacious. As many times as people said you couldn't do it, we would do it. And then we couldn't do this. But, I'm very proud of our team. We delivered the facility under budget as well as 5 weeks early.
Wow. Yeah. 2's a couple, 3's a crowd. I can imagine with 3 cities that always somebody would feel left out.
Well, that's really where our other capital program has come in. It's allowed us to invest in like a baseball facility in one of our cities and into an aquatics complex in another and into a rock climbing event in another. So it really gets easier to have a partnership when it is a partnership. Sometimes they need you, a little assistance on what they're trying to do. Sometimes we need them. But ultimately, and again, I think Susie hit this right on the nail, is our strategy is we live at the corner of community and commerce because everything we do delivers on both of those. And again, as she's talking about who you're talking to via the marketplace, obviously when we're talking to our hoteliers, we're talking about commerce, but let's be real. All of their kids live in our community. They play in our youth sports. So they're getting benefits on both sides. It really is a win-win situation.
So that's always a challenge when you go to build one facility. It has a precise location, right? And some people are closer to that and some are further away. But what I hear you saying to our listeners is spread the love, figure out ways to bring some of those facilities into each of the communities.
Well, and obviously the end goal is to disperse visitors into the hotels. And our hoteliers know, even if I'm not next to it, I'm going to get compression. And so therefore rates will rise and everybody, we lift the entire occupancy. So it does float all boats.
Susie, I want to pick up on what you said of Wichita being basketball country. You've had some success in that space. Can you tell us about it? We
have. And when you think of Kansas, a lot of people think of the Kansas Jayhawks, and I'm very proud. I am a Jayhawk too. And we're right down the street in Wichita with the Shockers, who went to the Final Four several years ago. So this community in Kansas has a rich basketball history. So part of a new facility that was built here about 10 years ago, our arena downtown, the goal when they built was let's host an NCAA tournament. And we had that opportunity to do so a couple of years ago. We were slated to host this March again for our second time, but unfortunately with their change of plans. But one thing about when you have an event and you tie into an event that resonates with your community, it's not just a given that it's going to be a smash success. There's a lot of work that goes into it. So when we were hosted the rounds 1 and 2 a couple of years ago, we went at it. We're like, you know what? We're going to treat it like a Final Four. We know our arena is only big enough to host at this point men's first and second rounds. We're not going to get the Sweet 16 or the Final Four, but we're going to treat it like a Final Four. And we went into it with that attitude. And when the NCAA came, there was a party on going all the way around the arena. It was an outdoor 3-day event, like the Final Four atmosphere. And the practice day, like if you're big basketball fans and you tune in and watch practice day and you can see it around the community, you might get a handful of fans, but we treated it like it's an opportunity to get in and see some incredible ball. And we sold out practice day, and NCAA had never seen that.
Wow.
And it was like, we're bringing people in, and it's like, whatever your strength is, if you can't host the Final Four, but you can host the rounds 1 and 2, celebrate it, treat it like the sport of Final Four. When it resonates with the community, they'll come out. So taking basketball all the way down the line, last summer we hosted the TGT, that basketball tournament, and it was the first time we'd hosted in Wichita. And again, if they're not familiar with, they bring alumni out and you play, and we hosted it in at WSU, and it was interesting. It set all the records for the first time our in TGT, but the fans came out and they treated it like, and I'll tell you one final story, KU never plays Wichita State. They just won't. They met in the tournament a few years ago. They don't play. So we were able to bring in this tournament our 3 state schools, Wichita State, Kansas State, KU, under one roof. Granted, it was the alumni, and they played. And to see this, again, sold out atmosphere and bring into the towns, into the community. So it's taken basketball. And then we've also taken it and are hosting the wheelchair basketball championships. So looking at a sport that works for your community and looking at all angles, and then celebrating it.
Find what's working, build on it. I like what you said, celebrate it. That's really a key to success. Yeah, that's great. I want to remind all of our listeners, please, if you have questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're getting some questions in now, but please feel free to ask your questions. We'll be answering those in just a moment. Before we get to that, let's turn to sort of the COVID era. We're all struggling with this. We're all dealing with it. It's been incredibly difficult for our industry. And in particular, devastating to sports and tournaments. Susie, can you talk a little bit about the restrictions you've had to deal with and how you've dealt with that and how you see it going through recovery as it relates to the sports activities that you fund?
Yeah, and we're a little bit unique in that we do have the restrictions on. Right now we're in a 25-person gathering, but sports and youth sports have continued throughout this, where I know different states they have. And so where we saw our large sports, like we were hosting the USA volleyball team, those big sports all were postponed into 21. So as I look to 21, we're expecting, a strong march on with sports. So those were rescheduled. But it was interesting, John, that some of the events kept going. And so we found our role pivoting to be that liaison between our health department and the sporting event. We hosted a motocross event in the summer. And so we helped facilitate that ready to race document so that it gotten the blessing, if you will, from our health department to continue with their safety measures. So we've seen it where some of our outdoors have continued, our local have continued, and there's been, I think, pros and cons to that, because a lot of the local businesses who have shut down, had to shutter or restrictions, wonder why are sports continuing. So there's been a lot of internal discussion about should they continue, should they not. But right now, we just had the community hosted an event this past Saturday, a basketball event. So they are continuing even with those restrictions in place.
Wow. Wow. And David, I want to ask you about COVID on this day, a day of celebration, right? The very first person in the UK to receive the Pfizer vaccine. What a terrific development that is. We're all looking forward to that. Can you talk to us a little bit about your 2021? What do you have there as an outlook? Are you booked in 2021? And what do you see happening through the recovery?
We're really booked. Donna, who's our salesperson for sports, has done a great job, as well as Cheryl handling our other markets. But if we were able to do items, we have something on the books for every weekend except 4 right now, and assuming we can move forward. But we're juggling. California is slightly different than Kansas. We have had no sports. We've been allowed to practice in pods. which we've had some volleyball folks in doing at our facility, but we haven't had the go-ahead for any sports. What we have shifted to is we do have guidance from the state under a swap meet or retail destination. So we've sort of pivoted to do more retail events during our shutdown here. And they've become very successful and now will become a staple as we move forward. So it's interesting. You go with the flow and you monitor it every day.
Yeah. So you found a way to make it through. When you say retail, what kinds of things were you doing to make it through this COVID era?
There was a great junk hunt, which was, again, vendors. We did an anime, which again was based on the vendors, a Comic-Con. We did a rock and mineral show. So it's those types of events that really it's consumer to a vendor booth that is the crux of the event. Obviously, we had to subtract a lot of the entertainment pieces out of it and those things that created gatherings or crowds, which is the other nice thing. If you have 100,000 square feet, you can socially distance pretty well for an event. And so we have giant ceilings, so it's very clean, very safe, and most people are comfortable if they're venturing out at all. So.
And I want to ask both of you as we start to get into the questions, if you had one piece of advice for our listeners that are thinking about funding either additional sports activities or sports venues, what would you encourage them to think about? And David, I'll start with you. What would your one piece of advice be to folks that are thinking of embarking on something like what you did?
Well, if you're talking about a facility, you need to really, really do your homework, because it's not just build it and they will come. We had a great infrastructure for sports tourism. You know, we're a clean, green, safe communities, and we've been doing sports for quite a while. So that mechanism was already in place. We weren't introducing something new. We just expanded our field. And in looking competitively, there wasn't much around us, or very little, that could handle what we were talking about. But it's really pairing those two. If you take a facility without any ability to program it or sell it or incentivize it, you know, that's a challenge. But conversely, if you don't have facilities, you're not even on the list yet, which has really been one of our strategies overall. We've maintained a significant capital ongoing program to ensure that this facility, as well as others, keep rising with the new developments for the event organizers.
And Susie, on your end?
Yeah, I'm going to echo the research. We are embarking on a project right now with a piece of land with the city and trying to figure out the best use of it from a sports perspective. And so really bringing, and we're working with some consultants, but really making sure you do your homework on what that best use is. But I think overall, John, my advice would be set up the funding like you've talked about that can't be diverted and can be used for these initiatives. But you're going to have naysayers. And so my advice would be take the no's as a strong maybe and keep pressing forward.
Fantastic. And we've got a couple of questions, so let me turn to those. David, first for you, were the TBID funds used for building the facility only for a limited time? Didn't you go back to it? Didn't you go back to a different TID rate?
No, because one of the benefits you get if you're in California for a district, you can do for 10 years and then, or 5 years and do a renewal. When you have debt in California, you can't disestablish the district. So until our debt is paid off, it's solid for the same number.
Got it. And folks have asked both in the Q&A and in the chat about a recording. And yes, this is being recorded, and recorded versions are going to be made available. So we will have that available to everyone afterwards. We also got a question, not surprisingly, about esports. Would you have any advice for events that haven't proven a high hotel room uptake, such as esports? How might they be funded? Susie, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. You know, one thing you might look into is creating a scorecard that helps your team evaluate events. We're working on that right now on, what other benefits come from it. And that might help you internally, because a lot of the discussion we have internally is, do we fund this? Do we not? a scorecard weighing, you know, community interest versus room nights versus, you know, quality of life, an alignment with a partnership or a business in your community. There's a lot of different ways. So I would look at it holistically, but I'll tell you, I'm with you on the esports. You know, we're having those discussions here. In fact, I had a couple emails in my inbox right now about some funding and some things with esports. And I know, David, you and I were chatting about that, and you've got some perspective as well on the future of esports.
It's a challenge for us right now just because of what the facility offers. We've dabbled in it, you know, to upgrade the computer needs as well as the Wi-Fi. There are places being built that are designed for this. And so I think that's going to be some of the challenge. Although it is about more than just the event. If you create something that is about more than the event, and so camaraderie becomes special. You know, it's just like we're doing Zoom now, but we'll be back to conventions and conferences soon, hopefully, where we can, you know, talk one-on-one and grab a drink at the bar. So it's, you have to work it to understand it. And again, we're not a great success in esports. So,
And David, I would assume for those folks looking to build new facilities, that would be one use that they would be investigating, right? That would be another sort of joint use potential of a facility.
It certainly would be. Again, when you're a tourism improvement district, we really have two issues. Are we driving occupancy and are we driving rate? You know, so that's kind of nice to have a very simple focus. We know our economic impact bleeds over to the restaurants and all those things, which is the other great thing about youth sports. You tend to see it at your restaurant because everybody's dressed alike. So you don't have to go out and sell to restaurants that you're getting these things because the kids go there and the adults go there and the teams go there and they see it. So it's doable.
Boy, what a great discussion. I could talk with you guys all day long. It's just, I hope our listeners are finding this valuable. I certainly did. I want to say thank you to everybody that participated in the webinar today. Thanks to Jeff Gaduck at Premier Travel Media for co-hosting this event. It's been terrific. Also, thank you to Al Kidd, President of Sports ETA, for all the work you're doing nationally for sports. And of course, to our panel, Susie, Santo, David Attaway. I said at the beginning, you're both trailblazers in your industry, and we've seen that today in everything you said. David, I love what you said. I'm going to use this, and I hope our listeners do too. We are at the corner of commerce and community. And I think you said community and commerce. I love that. What a terrific wrap up for our session today. Thank you, everybody. We hope you have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.